Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Miguel Benitez, helping you in your journey toward a thoughtful Christianity. And so today I actually have a guest that I'll be having a conversation with, Jacob Beal. His YouTube channel is Coffee and Tea Studios. I came across the YouTube channel just in searching different videos on Christianity and the arts, came across his YouTube channel and really appreciated some of what they had to say. He's also recording some of the some different music and songs that he posts as well for you guys to check out. So I'll be sure to link his YouTube channel down below. But Jacob, welcome. Thank you for joining me, and tell us a little bit about yourself, your educational background, and what it is that interests you about this discussion about Christianity and the arts.
Thank you, Miguel. So basically, I guess my educational background first. I went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, got a degree in ethnomusicology for my bachelor's, and so essentially that's studying how music functions in particular cultures around the world. And then I came back home to Spokane, Washington State, and studied at Eastern Washington University and got a degree in music composition. And so since then, I've been, figuring out, my questions have been, how do I use my education and what I do in the arts for the glory of God and the progress of the gospel in the place around me. And if anybody's interested, I do post more of my classical compositions on a different YouTube page. So I can share that as well if anybody's interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I can put a link to either one or both in the description. So definitely thank you for that. Yeah, so I came across your YouTube channel and just really liked the desire to want to help Christians think through these issues, which is something that definitely I'm interested in. And then your channel takes it a little bit further in that it has an interest of actually showing Christians producing art and participating in the artistic process. So I would certainly encourage anyone watching this to check that out. But I thought to myself, I'd love to have a conversation. So you and I got to speak last week and just kind of discuss our journeys and the way that the Lord has brought us to where we are now. And I thought it'd be great to be able to get a video up on the channel, just us having a conversation about one of the issues that Christians think about when it comes to the arts and our faith. And so you had made a comment last week on a video that I posted on does art style matter? Because a lot of Christians believe that it's just the content itself that matters. So it doesn't matter what style of music, what style of painting, what style of literature or poetry. It's just the words themselves or the content within the painting itself that matters. And I tried to make an argument in that video that while content is important, style also does communicate something. And so you commented that you thought, kind of going even beyond that, style is really helpful to us in that it can perhaps help us better understand the culture around us or the culture of the day when that particular style came about. Right. So I'm just wondering, how is it that you think art style helps us to better understand the culture?
Right. And so when you were making that video, you were talking a lot about romanticism and how, sorry, I'm hearing an echo myself a little bit. So basically how perception was becoming really important. How we see things, how we perceive things to be is what truth is. Now that's helpful for a Christian, I think in a couple different ways. One that I think helps visualize how the world tends to see something or how people around you are understanding something. And I think that's primarily important because when you're expressing the gospel to somebody or to a culture around you, you're going to want to be able to know how they're going to receive it. So I mean that's anywhere you go, you're going to want to understand how they understand something to be. And then it's also important when how do you say it? Just, I guess basically when we do engage with the culture, it does help us kind of peer into it. Now, how Christians could access and use art like that, obviously would have to take a different tone or a different mentality behind it if there was supposed to be some kind of underlying message. And I think that is important for us to think through. And not that every single piece of art has to be striving for absolute clarity of the gospel. There's plenty of Psalms that are just, well, obviously dedicated to the glory of God, but also they do have an expression of other simple things as well, or just parts in Scripture. But yeah, I do think it is it's usable, but I do think that there needs to be some kind of we need to be careful about how we use it, basically. So, for instance, if I was going to paint something, not that I'm a painter, but if I was going to paint something that was in the style of the Romantics, my understanding would be we don't see these clear lines because, as a human, my understanding of how I see things is flawed in itself. But that doesn't negate the fact that truth outside of me does exist.
Yeah, it's interesting because I started to think about it. I had someone ask me after seeing the video, can we as Christians redeem styles of art, right? So even if, so something like the Impressionists who, you know, who basically said, you know, they fell into a kind of empiricism that does ultimately lead to skepticism, right? And it kind of tailspins down from the originals. So the original Impressionists, we could say, even were still producing good art, thoughtful art, but it kind of tailspins from there. But I was thinking along the lines of something that in some way the image may communicate, this is what I see, this is what I experience, but in some way I know that there's a greater truth, or that there's something beyond just what appears to me. And I'm not a painter either, so I don't know what that might look like, but I could envision someone possibly painting in an Impressionist style, but somehow communicating, I'm not suggesting this is all there is.
Right. Yeah, I think it is important to keep the mentality that the gospel is able to redeem everything. So how those things are used in a gospel mind frame, I think is going to look slightly different and is going to mean something slightly different. But that doesn't mean that there should be some kind of an appreciation to a certain degree, I think. When I do take a look at secular artists, we were talking about John Cage, that's a little bit later, but I do think there's a kind of appreciation you can have, and he is helpful, I think, when you are looking at how our present day culture thinks. I think it's kind of indicative to what how a lot of people think. It's just an expression of modern day culture.
Yeah, that's good. And we will get to John Cage here in a moment. But something you said that I thought was interesting, and something we've talked about previously, is this idea about when Christians are producing the art, it doesn't necessarily, we want it to be redeeming, but it doesn't necessarily need to be explicit in its gospel presentation, right? It's not, a lot of art is not propositional. It's not something that is actually giving us just a flat out statement, but is communicating ideas, but in a different way. And so Francis Schaeffer says that he thinks Christian artists should realize and utilize the fact that there are two themes in Christianity, what he calls the minor theme and the major theme. And so his minor theme is that it is the fallenness of man. So he thinks it's perfectly appropriate for a Christian to produce art that communicates the fact that we're in a broken and fallen world without necessarily bringing in the hope and redemption in every single piece of work, right? He says, but when we look at an artist's entire body of work, we would hope to see that even if there are particular pieces that focus on this minor theme, there's going to be a redemptive message overall that's being communicated. And so
Right.
I was just curious your thoughts on that idea of the minor theme of the fallenness and then the major theme of redemption.
It's a little bit off topic, but it kind of reminds me of, I'm going to very ambiguously reference a psalm, but I'm not sure. I think it's somewhere in the 80s. I was listening to a Tim Keller sermon. He was talking about this particular psalm that basically said, God, in essence, get away from me, let me die. Just let me be here. It was pretty much just a wallowing the whole psalm. Which I found interesting because I thought, for one, like separate from the whole work of the Psalms, it would seem almost unorthodox in the way that it's written. But because it's wedged in between other Psalms that, very explicitly declare His praise, I think it's there partially because it's showing human pain and how we often want to, God understands the pain that we go through. But it also makes me think of, like we talked last time, the Song of Solomon. In essence, that the entire book is a love story, right? And it's not. I mean, you can take it a couple of different ways and see how Christ is working in that book, but at the same time, it's not necessarily completely about, or it's not really about, not explicitly about the gospel presentation, but about life. And I do think that there is definite room in Christian art and to basically just express how we are living. There's essentially it's assuming Christian fundamentals to be true, and then producing art based on those fundamentals. Now, it doesn't have to explicitly drive to the gospel every single time to, in a way, be declaring what is true about the gospel.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think that for Christians, it's really important that not just Christian artists realize that they have that freedom, but for maybe folks like me who are Christians, care about the arts, but not necessarily an artist, giving artists that freedom, right? Not thinking that they need to, everything they paint needs to have a cross on it, or every song that they sing needs to mention Jesus, but giving them that room for true expression of the human condition in its totality, not just one particular area. And I'm not suggesting that the gospel doesn't permeate through all of life, but we can communicate, I'm having a bad day, and I don't need to immediately bring the gospel to bear on that conversation.
Well, I think it's because of the permeation of the gospel in everyday life that speaking on those things makes sense in Christian art. Like because the gospel is the platform on which we stand, everything else has its place in that.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. So I'm curious, you mentioned John Cage in your comment in my previous video as someone who serves as an example of the way that maybe he was communicating what his culture was experiencing, or at least what he personally was experiencing. And as I was sharing with you before we started recording, I like Francis Schaeffer. I appreciate that he was willing to engage with theology and the arts and what that might look like in the Christian life. He had a very negative view of. In fact, earlier today I watched a video by Prager University that says, "Why is modern art so bad?" And the 5-minute video or whatever is all about how horrible modern art is. Now, you didn't weigh in one way or another. You just thought, we should be in tune to what it's communicating, what ideas are coming forward from that. But in particular, I'm curious what it is that you find intriguing about someone like John Cage, who is pushing the boundaries. When he comes onto the scene, he's in many ways pushing boundaries of what we would have called music. I'm sure I'm not saying this is necessarily what you had in mind, but what always kind of comes up is 433, right?
Right.
And for those who maybe aren't as familiar, it's basically a score where no music is played, but he frames the I guess, and I'm not a music person, you could probably explain this better, but he kind of frames the moments in which music would have been played.
Right.
And then he goes on to say that it's the ambient noises that provide the music there. So, and for those of you who aren't as familiar, I'll put a link down to at least someone demonstrating this 433. But maybe it was other things that kind of stood out to you about John Cage. So tell me, what is it that you think, coming from a Christian perspective, you find intriguing about John Cage, and what might we learn other than more the Schaefferian idea that this is just the sign that music has lost its way?
So I think, first of all, I think he is kind of a logical end to, I think, the Romantic period. I think things were kind of heading that way, not just him, but people kind of surrounding that era right there, where, in a sense, art did kind of collapse on itself, and kind of like the philosophy of the day, just a lot of meaninglessness, I think, started to kind of emanate from the way people were thinking, or still are thinking, really. So I think he was a Buddhist, and I could be wrong on that, but I think he kind of like a Zen Buddhist in his thinking. And I find him helpful and intriguing, but the 433 I think is interesting. I guess I should probably mention first, I wouldn't say I'm a fan of his work. Generally, I tend to feel negatively about his work, but at the same time, I do have an appreciation for what he did. So that leaves me in kind of an awkward position, because I like it, but I also very much dislike it. Generally, when people ask me about it, I say I like music when it has, or I like art if it's able to express a good why. I don't think he has a good why he does what he does. But at the same time, I appreciate that he exists because it helps me visualize conceptually what modern art has brought itself to. So you have 433, but you also have some of his other works where he would take basically chance music. So you would roll dice, and based on the numbers that the dice provided, he would notate his score that way. So he would have kind of a one-to-one type of comparison. And I've seen some other types of music that have sprouted from that I find very beautiful, that are based on kind of his ideas. Like my professor back at Eastern Washington University, Dr. Jonathan Middleton, he wrote many scores based on DNA sequences, which I find very beautiful and very intriguing, because and here's, I think, the big difference is there's a purpose behind it. So meaninglessness, I don't think, is something you can convey effectively in art, because it's inherently meaningless. And so I think, to me, when I look at his music, and I'm sure there's tons of 21st century musicians that would disagree with me, but it seems like that's what he's trying to convey. And from a Christian perspective, I find him intriguing and helpful when I'm trying to understand modern day culture, but I don't particularly enjoy him, and I do feel negatively about the things that he expresses. Although some of his music is interesting, some of his piano pieces, they're prepared piano pieces. Basically, he put stuff into the piano, and those are very rhythmic and fun. So for people that are looking for something different to listen to, I think those are enjoyable. But the majority of his work, I think his teacher said it best about him, Arnold Schoenberg. He said, "It sounds like you're hitting yourself against a wall when you're composing."
Yeah, so that's really interesting. And so I do, whenever I teach humanities, the modern period, I always do mention Cage because I think he's a significant figure, in the art world. And I will show a YouTube video of an orchestra or a pianist performing his 433. But I'll also let them listen to some of his prepared piano pieces in which, like you said, he'll stick screws and pieces of things into the piano to kind of wreck the sound of it.
Right.
And it is interesting the shift that occurs in my classroom. So I initially start with the 433, and there's just this uncomfortable moment of like, what is happening, and why are we watching this?
Yep.
And then when I when I discuss kind of his worldview and some of those things, it starts to make sense. This guy's kind of weird. This guy, some odd ideas. But then when I allow them to listen to the prepared piano pieces, they can kind of appreciate it. It's different, and sometimes, and I don't know music, and so hopefully this makes sense to you what I'm communicating. But I don't know if when you listen to music, sometimes there's just a moment where a certain key seems right, like it completes the emotion almost.
Mm-hmm.
His oftentimes fail to do that, right? Like you're headed in a direction and then it doesn't complete. It doesn't give you that satisfaction that oftentimes other pieces will give you. And I wonder if that's intentional and also because of the rigging of the piano in a particular way.
There seemed to be a lot of that kind of thinking in the 20th century in regards to music, at least trying to branch off from at least what had been happening in the Romantic era, with kind of this very voluptuous kind of over feeling. Everybody has so many emotions, and there's this kind of, in some musicians, kind of this rejection of that overabundance of feelings, basically. One of my favorite 20th century composers, and he's a big pillar in American music, is Charles Ives. Does that name ring a bell?
I'm not familiar, no.
So he's a bit older than, I just lost his name, 433 guy.
Cage,
thank you. So Charles Ives, he was also an experimentalist. His philosophy was more universalist, more one world government kind of, he was around the time of the world wars, and so I think a lot of his mentality was, someday everything's going to be all hunky dory and peaceful. But he wrote his music very aggressively. He's one who pioneered what's called bitonality, and did a lot of other weird things, like he would have a piano duet but tuned the pianos a quarter of a step off, and so everything sounds very bizarre. But his music I find very, very intriguing. Not always beautiful, often very hard to listen to, but I like it because it does have a purpose behind it. He uses a lot of old American music, a lot of hymns and reworks, and does a lot of musical quotations by borrowing little bits from Beethoven, borrowing little bits from old camp tunes, and mixing them all together into a big hodgepodge of overabundance of contrapuntal movements and stuff like that. It's just very bizarre, but at the same time, his music, I think, is easier for me to grasp because it has a purpose behind it, and that's what I find to be more interesting about his work, as opposed to someone like Cage's, where it seems like they, and a lot of painters, they just kind of want to strip meaning away.
Yeah, and so how might we encourage Christians who encounter art that seems odd, right? I know a lot of times the reaction I get either from my students or from other people where I'm having these conversations and I try and share a particular piece with them, and as we're conversing, oftentimes just the oddness of it will turn them off. How is it that we might want to encourage Christians to approach art in that you're suggesting, this can be very revealing to us, about the culture, and so there could be value in better understanding these more well-known works of art.
One thing, you mentioned James White last week. One thing I do really appreciate about his work is that when he's taking a look at a particular worldview, specifically like Islam or Mormonism or things like that, he does invest the time into trying his best to understand that particular worldview as they see it. And so letting them be their own self-definers of their own world belief or worldview. And so I think art, in a way, is a way for us as Christians to be able to actively engage into what the world believes. And so I think that's really important, not just letting other world beliefs be foreign, distant, scary, and frightening when the gospel calls us to not be afraid, rather to let ourselves engage with the gospel, let the theology bite back, let the gospel bite back, and understand those things through the gospel. But at the same time, let them be what they are. Let them be with let them be. This might be controversial now for some reason, but let the art that the author, or the meaning that the author wanted to convey through their art, let that be its own presentation rather than trying to put your own meaning into it. Do try to understand it from their perspective, and I think that is very revealing.
Okay, and that obviously brings up huge aesthetic questions that we probably don't have the time to jump into, as to whether or not we have a responsibility to allow the artist to convey what they're saying, or whether art can just be interpreted however we choose, right? So that, I think a lot of the more modern and postmodern kind of art interpretations almost want to suggest there is no proper interpretation, and so
Right.
I think that obviously would be an issue in itself. That's something that I would definitely want. I plan to talk more on in the future, but if you have a comment, I'd love to hear it on that.
Mostly just plainly, I think we can see there is a benefit to seeing something postmodernly for a moment, saying, okay, how do I see this? How does this affect me? But at the same time, I think the primary goal should be to see how did the author or the artist or the painter, the composer, how did they see this piece of art? What were they trying to convey? Rather than trying to pull some kind of foreign meaning out of the piece that you're working with.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I actually think that the only reason we would, as Christians, be tempted to ignore the question of how does this make me feel is in almost an overreaction to postmodernism, and almost buying into Enlightenment thinking that says, no, everything is just pure rationality and almost this scientific formula to everything we do. As Christians, I mean, obviously the way something makes us feel, because we have a conscience, because we're emotional beings, how something makes me feel is relevant to the discussion. But I don't think we have to confuse our feelings with interpretation. We don't have to confuse our aesthetic experience with the original meaning of the art piece itself.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay, and so one last question here, and we can kind of close on this, but I'm curious your thoughts. Those who have hung in there and have listened to this in its entirety, and probably have been asking themselves, and it's a question I get often, what's the big deal? What if I just like a particular piece of work, right? A particular song or a particular painting. I don't know anything about the philosophical background. I don't know anything about the worldview of the artist. Doesn't that almost, in a sense, make you safer because you have no awareness of what they're trying to communicate? And if you don't know and you just like this particular piece of art, does it even matter, right? Can art really influence our worldview if we're not aware of what the artist was initially trying to communicate?
Right. Well, I think it depends on a couple things. How explicit I think is um, the worldview, or and not that you can't enjoy something from a different worldview, but um, you can be affected by it. Um, I think a lot of it has to do with the wording, or like if it's a piece of music, and there's a lot of expletives, let's say, or the message of the piece of music is very corrupt, and I mean, there's a lot of that out there. I don't think that there is a lot of reason to partake in like living in that world. I don't think that means that we need to shut our ears and not hear something, but I don't think we should let it become a part of us, because I think it's easy for us to kind of justify and say, well, it's a piece of music that makes me feel good or I like, therefore I should be okay to listen to it and not be affected by it. I think that's being extremely arrogant in your ability to separate yourself from the music that you like or the art that you like to partake in. Again, I don't think that means that we need to shut our ears. And I've heard a few Tupac songs. That's the first person that came to my mind. But I'm not gonna just sit in my car and listen to a bunch of Tupac, because I don't want the negativity of his music to impact me in my thinking. And so I think we need to be constantly aware, but more so letting the Holy Spirit convict us and let us listen to the working of the Holy Spirit in our lives, so that we have some platform to say, no, I think I'm going to separate myself from this piece of work, because I think it is hurtful. At the same time, I do want to emphasize, I don't think that means that we need to shut our ears to other pieces of work. I think it's worthwhile, like reading other religious texts. I think it's worthwhile listening and hearing what the world has to say on particular issues, so that we have a platform of understanding when we're speaking to other people.
Yeah, certainly wouldn't want to encourage Christians to fear art for this reason. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times that's what we kind of get into, is anything that's a little odd, anything that seems different, we kind of reject it, realizing that there can be value. You mentioned Tupac. It's funny, he came up in a conversation I was having earlier today with a friend. And so to say that there isn't any kind of talent or any kind of important message that he perhaps had would be to overlook, right? I mean, Tupac was made in the image of God, and Tupac to some extent reflected that, even in his talents and abilities. But as you said, we wouldn't necessarily want to be taking that in on a regular basis, because it does have an effect on us. And I was thinking, and I'm curious what you think, doesn't that in itself, if we believe, as long as we kind of ignore the worldview aspect of the artist, doesn't that almost reveal something about our own understanding, our own worldview toward art, that we think what the artist has to say doesn't in any way affect us, doesn't in any way hit us, perhaps even revealing maybe a worldview assumption that we've bought into and may not be aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite possibly. I do think it's worthwhile at least noting what perspective people come from when partaking their art. And sometimes it might be, like, if it's associated with particular worldviews, or not say worldviews, but sometimes our conscience would lead us to disengage from something altogether if something is associated with something bad enough. But at the same time, yeah, I don't want to run away from knowing something about the author or artist that might help me better understand where they're coming from. But that most of the time I don't think is an indicator of whether or not I'd listen or watch most of the time.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for having this conversation with me. I hope that it's a blessing to others as they tune in, and hopefully helping others think through these difficult and challenging issues.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. So make sure to comment down below. Be sure to check out Jacob's YouTube channel as well, which I'll have in the description. And if there's any other questions regarding this intersection of faith and Christianity, I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to try and tackle them sometime in the future. Until next time, guys, be blessed.